It is a pleasure to welcome you back yet again for our discussion about Russia. Russia is the largest country. It used to have 11 time zones back when I was there in 1994. In 2010, they cut this back to 9 time zones. It's about the eighth largest economy in the world, hence the G7 became the G8, the eight largest economies in the world. The ministers from them come together. They talk about financial things. They added Russia back in the 1990s. But when we talk about the Russian economy, which we'll get into, it's really antiquated. It relies on this post-Soviet industry. They haven't had much foreign direct investment. Where they have had foreign direct investment, and where most of the investment's been and where most of the economy is based is in their enormous natural resources. And that's been a huge source of cash for them. So we're talking about diamonds, diamonds, gold, copper, iron, and they're responsible for about 20% of the world's oil and gas production, which has been key to the growth in the 2000s under Vladimir Putin. They're the number one natural gas exporter. They're the number two oil exporter, as well as producer, after Saudi Arabia, really, for both. So this is a country of 146 million people. Most live in the western part of the country. I remember when I was there, people used to think that everyone in the East were a bunch of cowboys, and it was a scary place. It was kind of a scary place. It's a long story. In terms of ethnic groups, it's about 80% ethnic Russian. Another 4% are other Slavs, so Ukrainians, Belarusians, for example. And then you've got 8% Turkic people, including 4% Tatars, who reside largely in Tatarstan, which is, where's Tatarstan? Kazan. It's Tatarstan down here. Again, Tatarstan. And then there are lots and lots. There are about 100 other ethnic groups. It's actually not very easy to be many of the others, quote unquote. I've had Central Asian friends who've lived in Russia who've found it very difficult to be there. But you go where the jobs are. Russia has a highly repressive history, and a history of poverty and insecurity. There's enormous poverty even today, between 20 and 50%, despite the huge boom that's come from the oil and oil prices in particular. Lots of inequality in Russia as well. The life expectancy in the post-Soviet period fell significantly from about 70 for men to about 58. Although it's beginning to rebound, has been rebounding lately. Still, you're talking about, classic for Europe, a shrinking population. This is also the classic illiberal democracy or competitive authoritarian regime, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So in terms of evolution, in the 9th century, you had this emigration from the north, these Vikings who came to Kiev and established the first Russian proto-state. They adopted Orthodox Christianity in the 10th century. And the picture on the left that you see is a 13th century Russian icon of St. Nicholas. The picture on the right is the sacking of a town by Mongols. This is important because Europe had their Renaissance, the rise of the middle class, and Russians had the Mongols, which is characterized by brutality and a system of tribute, and lasted from the 13th to the 15th centuries. Now note, the Great Horde, the Mongolian Great Horde, never actually settled in the country. Even taxes were delegated to Russian princes. The Russian princesses, I believe they're actually princes. The Russian princes collected the money and then handed it over. But they were brutal when they came to town. Which brings up the question, what sort of system are we talking about? Is this imperialism or colonialism? That's right, it's imperialism because they didn't have a presence on the ground, so it wasn't a colonial state. Ivan the Terrible, who lived from 1533 to 1584, so we're talking about the 16th century, gained fame by fighting off this Mongol yoke and launches this mission using terror to consolidate power. The only strong hand is the Tsar. A Tsar comes from the word Caesar. He has power above all else, everybody else. In the 1700s, you have Peter the Great, the guy on the right, who comes to power and pursues this policy of westernization. So, for example, the capital is moved from Moscow to St. Petersburg. They begin to emulate administrative systems from the West, educational systems from the West. Military reforms come from the West. But this was short-lived. By the mid-19th century, you had rulers, especially Nicholas I, who moved away from the West again. Um, so a question I might ask is, why might the reforms have been stopped or rolled back? Some um, things that you might think about are the relationship of entrenched interests within these institutions with the reform process. Don't usually like them. Nationalism. Remember, nationalism was growing in the 19th century, and Russia was no exception. So they were promoting Russian nationalism there, and nationalism doesn't bode well to have this process of emulating some other country or some other peoples when you're trying to foment nationalism at home. Uh, Maybe the role of personality, although it's always such a cop-out. Role of personality, personal rule by the monarch. But, we're talking about personalistic regimes, and so personality is really important. Cop-out as though it may be. So reforms were really only gradual. Russian serfs were emancipated only in 1861, which was very late for Europe. Of course, note that that was before our slaves were freed. In the 19th century, you've got a centralized state which grows in power. But it's largely an agrarian state, with industrialization really only kicking in the 1880s, and this was with heavy government support. What this means is that the middle class was really minuscule. The state was highly autonomous under the monarchy, but the aristocracy was increasingly unhappy, and the monarchy comes under threat by the turn of the 20th century. There were a couple big things that threatened the monarchy. One was the loss to Japan in 1904. And this was shocking for a European state. For a European state and remember, the Europeans, Darwin, Europeans had this belief that they were superior as a racial group, and so how can you lose to these non-Europeans? And so that was a factor. And then second, you've got this some degree of industrialization and urbanization, and with that, you've got more workers who are coming together and protesting conditions. But really, war was the catalyst. Okay, the war with Japan, and in 1905 you have a revolution. Okay, and the 1905 revolution occurred when you had industrial workers in the military that rebelled, and in the face of this rebellion, and you can see a picture right here. The Tsar gave concessions, known as the October Manifesto. He promised a bunch of things. He promised freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of association, meeting. He promised that no law would become operative without the approval of a new institution called the Duma. The Duma is the Russian parliament. So the Duma dates back to 1905. The Duma demanded the release of political prisoners, trade union rights, land reform, and so in mid-1907, the Tsar got tired of it, and he dispersed the Duma. And the Social Democrat deputies who were in the Duma were arrested. So a very short fling with democracy by the Tsar. So a big question to consider is how this compares with early pressures for democratization in the UK. So think about that. And that may be a discussion question that I put up. Now, what you find is, not surprisingly, that war is a catalyst for a second major upheaval. And so you've got to remember that World War I was fought by Russians without weapons. There were food shortages everywhere. People were sent literally to the front line without their weapons. People didn't have shoes. They didn't have clothing that was adequate for the winter. And so you have a military revolt which forces the Tsar down in March of 1917. The Russians were on a different calendar, so it's known as the February Revolution. And what you had was the establishment of the provisional government. This wasn't a communist government. There was a provisional government. They stay in the war. They are weak. They're really incapable of running the state. And the public is increasingly angry. And this leads to the October Revolution. Lenin and the workers of the Soviets, the Soviets are actually workers' councils. So there are workers' councils organized all over the cities. And Lenin, with these various worker councils, goes in and overthrows the provisional government. This was sort of a half revolution, half coup. There weren't a lot of people when you think about the country who took part, but it was a revolution because there was a significant public role in the cities. And there had been public protests going on for a long time. People were unhappy with the provisional government. So what happened is Trotsky and others took over the Winter Palace, which had been home of the czars since the 18th century, and then at that point was the seat of the provisional government in St. Petersburg, and they appointed themselves leaders. Again, there were relatively few participants, but there were huge protests preceding it. People were ready for a change. But what they got was a civil war and then a period of post-revolutionary violence, typical after a revolution. So from what you know about the targets of post-revolutionary violence in France, who do you think the targets were in the Soviet Union? Think about this for a second. Who were they in France? Well, about 18% were aristocrats, about 6% were clergy, 4% were the middle class, and then 72%, nearly three-quarters, were workers or peasants who were accused of a variety of things: hoarding, evading the draft, deserting, rebellion, anything that wasn't supportive enough of the revolution. So in the Soviet Union, sure enough, you had religious leaders from the old order, aristocrats from the old order, resistors, entrepreneurs, right, the bourgeoisie, traders, private farmers. Okay? Lots of people who just didn't show enough support for the revolution. Not that they were anti-revolution, but you had the first few groups are people who, I'll tell you about the Soviet trade in a second. The first few groups, the religious leaders from the old order, the aristocrats from the old order, these are people who might be seen as a threat. And then everyone else was even less of a threat, but they attacked them anyway. So we'll talk a little bit about the Soviet leaders. Let me take that on the news slide.